Hi, welcome to clip 2 of this week's lecture on reflexivity and feminism. As always, this second clip is really an attempt on my part to convey the core of the ideas that we're looking at in this week's lecture. And I'm particularly going to focus on the question of reflexivity, which is the kind of central concept that we're looking at this week. Feminism, as we'll see, is one of the historical currents and developments within anthropology that contributed to that crucial kind of turning point roughly in the 1980s, where anthropologists, particularly in the United States of America, began to argue that anthropological reflexivity is absolutely central, or has to be absolutely central, to the way anthropology is done. And without it, we produce effectively a dangerous anthropology. That's how far the argument goes. And the resonances with arguments being made today, I'm sure, are already felt by you, not least in the light of the kind of discussions we had in the first couple of weeks of the course. So the diagram that you're seeing down there, I just noticed that, as usual, my head interferes with bits of it. Sorry about that. Every week I make the same apology. The diagram that you're seeing over there in the bottom right corner will be familiar to you. It's the way I set up the kind of central problem of anthropology in the first week, if you remember. And if you don't remember, just consult the slides from that week and you'll see a version of this diagram there. And essentially you've got the anthropologist or the analyst on the one side, and then you've got the object of study, the people that this anthropologist is studying, the culture. And anthropology is conceived as an attempt to bridge potential gaps of understanding between the anthropologist's position, the stuff that they take for granted, the way that they think, and so on, and the way in which the people that they study go about their lives, how they think, what they take for granted, and so on. That difference, potential difference, is one that the anthropologist is always kind of tussling with and grappling with in their attempt to make sense, to understand, to gain a purchase, as it were, in their thinking and in their writing. And we've been seeing throughout the course the different ways in which that relationship is configured, depending on what you take the object to be, the relationship to be, what you take understanding to be, what you take humans to be, and so on, right? These are the kinds of central theoretical questions that this whole course is about, right? Now, this core idea of reflexivity basically comes down to the idea that the anthropologist is not themselves neutral in the position that they occupy and from which they seek to understand the people that they set up as the object of their studies, right? So just like the circle on the right hand, the object of study has a color, in this case blue, so does the position of the anthropologist. They also have a social, cultural, political, historical, and many other things, position from which they start their investigation. And what that means, if we take that seriously, is that the whole relationship of anthropology, the relationship between the anthropologist and their object of study, needs to be reconceptualized. It needs to be reconceptualized, particularly in relation to this classic kind of idea that anthropologists deployed from the 19th century onwards in trying to kind of sell themselves, so to speak, or imagine themselves at least, as some kind of scientist or observer whose data, whose insights were somehow objective or neutral, perhaps, somehow hovering above the phenomena that they're studying and trying to view it from an objective, neutral perspective, right? That whole kind of assumption, which underpins so much of the kinds of approaches that we've been looking at, in qualified ways, in complex ways, but nevertheless is always somehow there, comes under radical critique with this idea of reflexivity. And I put here the expression, what goes round comes around. Effectively, if anthropologists are the professionals who mete out the idea of culture, of society, of structure, as we saw, to the people that they're studying, well, they said they should take some of their own medicine, so to speak, because they too are cultural beings. They too live in particular social, historical, structural configurations, and not taking them into account in the act of doing anthropology leads to a really distorted half view of the very activity in which anthropologists engage, and leads to a really dangerous presupposition that somehow the conclusions that they reach, the insights that they write about and so on, can purport to be neutral and context-free. We need to own the fact that we're not neutral. We're always writing from a particular kind of context, and that context is central to the way that we understand that relationship of understanding that we purport to cultivate with particular social, cultural, etc. Groups that we study, right? So I've kind of cancelled out, in fact, that word understanding, not because reflexive anthropologists give up on it, but very much they emphasize the fact that this difference across which anthropologists are so often concerned with working is always asymmetrical. It's often unequal historically. So if you look at the way that the discipline of anthropology is developed, and we've looked already and kind of we'll look further next week and the following couple of weeks, the kind of colonial dimensions of this, which are absolutely central, of course. Anthropology is fundamentally a European, initially an American activity associated with white settler colonialism. And that relationship then, that context in which that relationship is configured between the anthropologist and the object of their study is irreducibly asymmetrical, often unequal, and shot through with dynamics of power and differences of authority. So being reflexive as an anthropologist is above all being aware of these dynamics and including them in the way that you go about your analyses, your arguments, your data collection. The whole array of activities that anthropological work involves need to be understood in this context. So anthropology is itself a socio-cultural practice. It is not a neutral act of some kind of pure understanding. That's the key thing. It expresses its own values, meanings, resources, and power distributions, and so on, right? So anthropologists don't stand above society and culture. They participate in it. They're part of it. So they're at the same level as the people that they're studying, right? The relationship of anthropology is horizontal. Horizontal in the sense, not that it's equal, but that we're conceptually at the same level. We are examples of exactly the same kind of thing that we are meant to be studying as anthropologists. Indeed, you can absolutely do an anthropology or indeed an ethnography of the very activity of anthropology. Though interestingly, there's not so much of that around. And one might ask the question, why is that? But anthropology is a socio-cultural practice and can be studied in the same way that anthropologists study, fishing or stock exchange in the city of London or whatever it might be, right? Because of all this, anthropologists' claims to authority, I talk about this kind of affiliation with the project of science, of universities, the ivory tower, and so on, that, through which the very idea of anthropology as a discipline has developed. All of this needs to be kind of reflexively deconstructed. In many ways, this idea of deconstruction is really, really important, kind of unpicking the conditions of possibility, the contexts that make it possible for anthropologists to claim these forms of authority that they have claimed, right? Because the differences between anthropologists and the people that they study, the A position and the O position, is not just an epistemic position, according to this approach in anthropology. It's also a socio-political position, right? Only by taking into account this broader context of the kind of historical and geopolitical dynamics that both relate and differentiate the anthropologist and the people that they are studying, can we actually properly deconstruct the activity of anthropology, and really, by doing so, put it in its proper footing according to this approach. And I note here that this emphasis on geopolitical and historical kind of dynamics and power dynamics and inequalities owes so much to kind of Marxist approaches in anthropology. So in many ways, this reflexive argument draws also on Marxism. And one crucial thing which I actually find most exciting about this approach to anthropology is the ways in which it raises the possibility that really fundamental concepts, the very infrastructure, the kinds of ideas and practices that anthropologists rely on in trying to bridge that gap of understanding that is at the center of the activity of anthropology, get questioned when you think reflexively in this way, right? So there's a kind of inward arrow of understanding where your own concepts and procedures and protocols and methodologies are always on the line when you take this kind of reflexive approach. So just as you try and understand someone else, you also have to always try and understand yourself. And those two activities need to go together according to this approach. So very central concepts such as the concept of society, culture, or structure, or indeed history, are all up for grabs when you adopt a really radical reflexive approach, the kind of approach to reflexivity that I myself am most interested in. So I've put here, to recall this Marxist diagram of a few weeks ago, I've put global geopolitics and history as the kind of green background that envelops the relationship between the anthropologist and their object of study. So, to wrap this clip up, the core agenda of reflexivity. Actually, I'm not sure I'm wrapping up because I think there's another slide as well about the core questions. The core agenda is to question positivism, the positivism of classical modern anthropology, this claim to science, to neutrality, to context, to freedom from context. Focus on the production of anthropological knowledge and authority, like really go into the kind of backstage of anthropology and make that part of the business of the anthropologist to be aware of that backstage. Focus on the asymmetries between anthropology and the people that they study. Being explicit about the way that our production of anthropological knowledge is situated. That's a really important term, and one of your readings, Donna Haraway's article for this week, is all about situatedness, a kind of ugly word, but I hope it conveys the meaning. Knowledge is situated. Anthropological knowledge is always situated according to a whole host of dimensions that characterize the anthropological's position. Positionality is another really important word here. Their class, their ethnicity, their gender, their sexuality, their disability, all of these aspects, these, as the bureaucrats call it these days, these protected characteristics, are all part and inflect and spin in particular ways the way that any particular anthropologist might frame their knowledge and their argument. This partiality of knowledge is something that you really have to embrace, as Donna Haraway also argues, if you're going to be properly reflexive. So you need to reflect always on how these positionalities, these ways of being situated, influence your capacity to understand what you're looking at as an anthropology. It's not just a matter of being biased. That's the language of the objectifying, the kind of neutral imaginary of positivism, right? It's not just that we're looking for a way to neutralize our biases. It's actually that this is central and constituted to the way that we produce anthropological knowledge. Reflexivity is not about trying to neutralize these positionalities, but to embrace them and to recognize them and acknowledge them for what they are. Put them on the table for discussion, not try and hide them as if they're a dirty secret, right? How do they format the questions that we ask and answer as anthropologists is the question, right? And this, of course, is a critical operation. So reflexivity is about being critical, radically critical, about our own possibility of gaining a purchase in our understanding and how we go about doing that. Being really critical about that and being critical about the procedures, the methods, the concepts, the categories that we deploy in trying to do that. And in being critical, another really important aspect of this historically, there's also this injunction to be experimental. Experiment with new ways of writing. Find ways to, transform the relationship between knower and known, the position between A and O, in the very form of the way that you do anthropology. These kinds of experimental writing styles, research styles, were often in the 1980s deemed to be part of a kind of postmodern movement. So if modernity is about positivism, certainty, progression in knowledge, building knowledge neutrally, the project of science, of enlightenment, postmodernity is the critical and often playful stance that people in social theory began to take in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, where all of this became questioned and deconstructed and played around with in all sorts of creative, some would say sometimes excessive ways. So now to close this slide, core questions for this reflexive approach. What is the positionality of the anthropologist in relation to the people that they're writing about? Absolutely fundamental reflexive question. How does that influence their view of them? How does ethnographic writing create the authority of anthropologists? Right? How do these authority effects in our writing get constituted in the way that we choose to write as anthropologists, right? The tropes through which, for example, claims to objectivity get established. What do those tropes leave out? What do they silence? What do they sweep under the carpet? And how might the presence of the people that we're studying be better reflected in our writing as anthropologists? Absolutely crucial question for the kinds of approaches that we're looking at this week. Might this whole kind of reflective approach not require also reflections on the ways that we do our research as well as the ways in which we write? What do anthropologists actually get up to when they're doing field work, right? Remember, I'm not sure if I've mentioned this, but perhaps you've heard about it already. Malinowski's diaries got published around that time in the 1980s, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And sent absolute shockwaves through the discipline when it became clear that in his private thoughts, Malinowski was in so many ways not living up to the kinds of ideas that he was expounding in his writing. In moments of personal kind of reflection, he said some horrific things, truly kind of racist and quite depreciatory comments about the people that he was doing fieldwork with. Now there's a whole debate around that, but certainly it sent kind of shockwaves through the discipline, and really understanding, how people operate in the field is part and parcel of this agenda of reflexivity. Not only to understand it, but hopefully to also reconstitute it and connect it to the kinds of conclusions that anthropologists are drawing, right? So in the light of these kinds of reflexivities, as a final question here, very central, how might anthropological research and writing need to change, right? For example, you, I'm sure, have heard about, in recent times in anthropology, there's a lot of talk about collaborative or participatory research methods where interlocutors of anthropologists, and note the change in the language that we use to talk about the people that we're studying, or that, as we say today, often the people that we're studying with, which is an interesting and not unproblematic expression in my view. So we've changed from talking about informants to talking about respondents or interlocutors, trying to reflect and constitute the relationship more transparent and horizontal, and less kind of objectifying, and with fewer claims to neutrality, as this idea of informants would suggest, right? So collaborative and participatory methods are all ways of trying to bring in the people that we're engaging with in our work as anthropologists, and acknowledging their co-productive status in the kinds of materials and analyses that we produce. So that's a very complex set of questions there, but I'm just pointing to it as central live issues in this question of reflexivity. Okay, I think this clip is probably long enough already. I'll leave it there and I'll see you in the next one.